The Russian-Ukrainian war is in its third year. 500,000 to 1 million people have been killed. Some Ukrainian cities and towns have literally been wiped off the face of the earth, and millions of peaceful people have lost their homes and have been forced to leave their homes. Ukrainians are tired, very tired. There are no more queues of volunteers in front of military enlistment offices. The flow of donations from the people of the army is practically dried up. The West is also tired of this war, and more articles appear in the Western media which call for sacrificing part of the Ukrainian territories for the sake of ending the war. In this video, we'll try to understand what will happen if Ukraine loses. What will the world be like in case of its surrender? Spoiler, in this case, the main loser will be the West. The question of what happens if Ukraine loses was once a tactical move to pressure Western allies for more arms and money. As time goes on, the question is becoming less and less of an afterthought and more of the first point of Plan B. After several difficult months on the battlefield, last year's hopes for a Ukrainian counteroffensive that would push Russia back to its former borders and humiliate Vladimir Putin have melted away. In my opinion, none of the important politicians in the West now believe in Ukraine's victory on the battlefield, as Josep Borrell, the European Union's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, was convinced a year ago. Hence the slowdown in arms deliveries and the growing disagreement over Ukraine's financing. The same promised unfortunate couple dozen F-16s cannot reach the Ukrainian army, and the West cannot train more than 24 pilots at the same time. You see, there are no places. Instead of acting decisively, the West hesitates. One or another EU country vetoes decisions on aid to Ukraine. One gets the impression that the Western elite clearly does not realize how Ukraine's defeat could turn out for them. So how? Let's consider two options. Option number one, or the light option, Ukraine agrees to peace in exchange for ceding part of its territory to Russia. And it should be understood that it'll have to give up more territory than Russia has seized so far. Putin unequivocally stated this. After the occupation of part of the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, so-called referendums were held there, and based on them, Russia included these regions in full into its territory. As early as 2022, it was done about Donetsk and Lugansk regions. According to the Russian constitution, all this is already the Russian Federation, and no one is going to give up Russian lands. That is, Ukraine will have to give up Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and dozens, if not hundreds, of other settlements. Russia will give up hundreds of thousands of fertile lands in the northern Black Sea region, dozens of mineral deposits worth hundreds of billions of dollars, hundreds of enterprises, and what's most valuable, millions of able-bodied people. All this will more than compensate for Russia's losses in this war, both in material terms and in human resources. Moreover, as the winner, Putin will not pay compensation for the damage caused, and $300 billion worth of Russian assets frozen in the West can hardly be considered sufficient compensation. But if Russia remains in a big plus, the West, on the contrary, will be in a big minus. And the most important thing is not the loss of some material and financial resources in the form of loans invested in Ukraine. There's a much more terrible loss, the loss of authority by the West. Ukraine's defeat would be humiliating for the West, a modern version of the Suez Crisis of 1956. Back then, Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, prompting a military invasion by Britain, France, and Israel. The USSR, threatening to bring in its troops, forced these three countries to withdraw their troops. The Suez Canal was left to Egypt. After that, in fact, the world began a parade of sovereignty. In 1959, Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba, and soon nuclear Soviet missiles appeared there. The Cuban Missile Crisis broke out. In 1960, 17 African countries declared their independence. These were the consequences of the then seemingly lost regional war. By supporting their ally morally, militarily, and financially for 2 years, America and Europe, perhaps unwittingly, put their own credibility on the line. That they were sometimes slow to provide support made the situation worse, not better. This further confirms the skeptics' view of liberal politics, that democracies are incapable of standing up for themselves. Some politicians in the West realize all this. For example, George Robertson, former head of NATO from 1999 to 2003, warned, "If Ukraine loses, the world order will be determined by our enemies." First of all, the European Union will feel the weight of humiliation. Already now, we can see how political forces that can be called pro-Putin are gaining more and more authority. And what happens if Ukraine loses? Politicians like Viktor Orban in Hungary or Marine Le Pen in France will say that they were right, that Russia should be a friend, and their voices will be heard as never before. The authority of Brussels will slip to zero, which may lead to the collapse of the European Union. One should also take into account the Trump factor, which advocates isolationism and is very skeptical about helping Ukraine. In his campaign promises, he states that he will stop the war in Ukraine even before assuming the office of the U.S. president in case of his victory. But this, if at all possible, is only possible by forcing Ukraine to sign a peace agreement in exchange for its territories. If the stars align in such a way that Trump comes to power and Ukraine loses, the European Union will inevitably disintegrate. Part of European countries will still be oriented towards the USA, but some will reorient themselves towards Russia and China, which is behind it, and which is not inferior to the USA in terms of economic power. And Russia is not inferior to it in military power. But the US will also lose a lot in its global position. Even now, the Global South is very skeptical about America's leading role, which is clearly manifested in the reluctance of these countries to sever economic ties with Russia, despite the enormous efforts of the European Union and the United States. Saudi Arabia has broken a 50-year petrodollar pact with the U.S. and will now sell oil and other currencies. This is a huge blow to the U.S. currency. France has effectively been kicked out of West Africa, where it dominated for nearly a century. And Niger, having kicked out the French and Americans, has invited the Russian military to the American base the U.S. built to stay. 5 more countries, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, have joined BRICS, dominated by China and Russia, effective January 1, 2024. And more than 20 other nations have expressed interest in joining BRICS, including NATO member Turkey. With Ukraine's defeat, we will not be surprised if some EU countries ask to join BRICS. After all, the weak always follow the strong, and in this case, Russia turned out to be the strong one. All this will strongly shake the position of the dollar, and it may cease to be the only reserve global currency. And then what to do with the U.S. national debt of $34 trillion? After all, if the dollar collapses, the world economy will collapse and chaos will reign on the planet for some time. And this means millions and millions more dead people due to lack of food, medicine, qualified medical care, etc. This we do not take into account very likely military conflicts, which always accompany the redistribution of the world. And with all this, the world will be in limbo. After all, Putin can continue his aggression. Let us remember history again. In 1938, to appease Hitler, the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia was given to him. That prevent World War II? It started the very next year. Even sadder for the West is the option of the complete defeat of Ukraine and its absorption by Russia. In this case, the length of the borders of Russia and the EU will increase by thousands of kilometers, and on all these thousands of kilometers will stand the Russian army, hardened, the only one in the world that has experienced large-scale war with practically NATO army. At the same time, this army will be reinforced by part of the Ukrainian military, which will switch to the Russian side. In that case, the cost of the U.S. and other NATO countries to defend Europe from further threats from the Russian Federation will be much higher than most people realize. That's if the U.S. wants to defend Europe at all, which, if Trump takes office, is not at all likely. He may decide that defending Taiwan is more important to America than defending Europe, and 2 simultaneous wars with Russia and China are definitely not something the U.S. can handle, whether it's Biden or Trump or anyone else in the Oval Office. Russia will own a lot of mineral deposits. Senator Lindsey Graham estimated them at $10 to $12 trillion. But the main thing is not these trillions of dollars, but the minerals themselves, for which the world is increasingly in short supply. Ukraine has 20% of the world's reserves of titanium, one of the largest reserves of iron ore, large reserves of uranium, 10% of the world's reserves of lithium, and the second place in the world in terms of manganese ore reserves. Ukraine is among the top 10 producing countries of titanium, zirconium, graphite, and manganese, and is the second largest producer of gallium in the world after China, and the 5th place in the world in the production of germanium after China, Russia, the United States, and Japan. All this will go to Russia. In short, if the second option is realized, the consequences for the European Union and the U.S. described in the first option will only intensify, and the catastrophic consequences will come faster. From all this, we can draw the only conclusion: it's much more profitable and cheaper for the United States to help Ukraine, at least to keep its position through constant military support of the West, than to let Ukraine lose. That said, freezing the conflict is worse than continuing to help Ukraine fight. It would simply give Russia time to prepare for a renewed war to conquer all of Ukraine and confront NATO. Whereas helping Ukraine regain control of all or most of its territory would be far more beneficial, as it would push Russian forces further east. Yes, if confrontation with Russia intensifies, the risk of nuclear war inevitably increases. But if Russia wins, this risk will still increase. If one is guided by the position that nuclear war is in any case unacceptable, it's certain to hand victory to Putin. Or maybe we should be guided by the philosophy espoused by the Russian dictator himself. Here are his words verbatim on the risk of nuclear war. Yes, it will be a global catastrophe for mankind. It will be a global catastrophe for the world. But as I, a citizen of Russia and the head of the Russian state, want to ask myself, why do we need such a world if Russia will not be there? Gentlemen of the Western elite, do you need a world without the West there? And what do you think? Is it necessary to help Ukraine no matter what, or still let it lose? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd be glad to get likes and subscribe to our channel. See you soon.